stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief story maker of Elkins Consulting.
When we share stories, whether in our personal or business lives, how we share them makes a difference in how we remember them and in how we're perceived by the people we're sharing them with. When you're listening to this podcast, I encourage you to listen and consider your own related stories. To listen and think about which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. And think about how you share those stories and the messages they carry for you and for the people who are hearing them.
Brian Miller, what a pleasure to see you on my Your Stories Don't Define You podcast. And I can see you, but our listeners will only hear you. But I have the pleasure of seeing you in your studio with your microphone. And so that's pretty cool. I don't always get this opportunity to see the person that I'm going to be interviewing. So thanks for joining me.
Oh, Sarah, thanks so much for having me. This is a pleasure. I'm glad we were able to connect so quickly.
Yes, me too. And I asked you to be a guest on my podcast because I had shared a podcast episode that you commented on about choosing self-reflection and realizing that you were getting in your own way in terms of having good relationships and choosing to change, choosing to make those adjustments so that you could have good, healthy relationships. So I was immediately intrigued and I had to learn more about that story. So before we get started, would you please share with the listeners and with me something about you that most people don't know, that we wouldn't find on your resume or your LinkedIn bio? And I ask that question so that my listeners can have some context for who you are when we start talking about, in depth and talking about our stories.
Yeah, so this is an interesting question because I was thinking through that and wondering, there are things that I would answer knowing that the people listening are people who already know me, that would blow their mind that they don't know. And then there's the people who by and large will be listening who've never heard me before, but are listeners of your podcast. So I have two for you. One is very quick and silly, and one is a little bit more deep and meaningful. So the quick and silly one is very, very few people would know at this point that at one time, it seems lifetimes ago, I was playing lead guitar in a professional 80s hair metal cover band. And we were like the big band in Buffalo, New York, where I'm from. And so we were the big local act. So when the major, big, huge, famous people came to town, they had their own opening act, but they always chose a local opening act to open for the openers, right? And so, you know that band that's like squished into the front of the stage that can barely fit up there? That was us for like the big headliners. And so at one point, we actually got to open for Bret Michaels of Poison, and meet him, and he was very fun and easy to talk to. So we actually got to play year after year. The Goo Goo Dolls, who are all from Buffalo, their bass player owns a restaurant in downtown Buffalo, and they invited us to be the band that rang in the new year for their restaurant every year. So we got to do that, and so it was a fun period of my life that I occasionally forget actually existed. So
isn't that cool? That is so cool. So were you playing guitar in high school, or when did you pick that up?
Yeah, music has been a part of my life longer than basically anything else has. My father was a professional musician when he was in his early 20s, and he actually put himself through his PhD by playing in like the number one wedding band on Long Island. You know, they were like a top 40 wedding band back in the, late 70s, early 80s, I guess. And so I was around music all my life. He was a bass player by trade. And so I picked up guitar late, all things considered. In 8th grade, I actually started playing. I had bounced around instruments for many, many years, but 8th grade, I actually got a guitar in my hand. And after many tries at many instruments and failing, trumpet, terrible, saxophone, I was bad at, piano I was good at, but didn't like most kids don't, didn't enjoy chorus or anything. Got a guitar in my hand, was like, Van Halen, here I come, this is it. And I really progressed very quickly because I was obsessed. And actually originally was going to college for music. I got accepted into Berkeley College of Music, and then chose not to go because it was $52,000 a year back then. And
Oh,
yeah,
whoa.
I remember at least I was smart enough at 17 years old to look at that and go, all right, if you go $200,000 in debt and come out with a degree in electric rock guitar, you're probably screwed for life. So, so we didn't do that, and somehow we ended up here instead.
Oh my gosh, that's so cool. And of course, part of that is what I find particularly interesting is that you recognize that before you went, because just having the honor of being accepted makes it really hard to turn down.
Yeah.
So I can really understand that it had to have been a very difficult decision for you.
It was, yeah, it was gut wrenching. I'd worked for a year to prepare for the audition and everything. And I guess nobody at any point had said, hey, just so you know, if you do get in, it's really too expensive. We can't afford to send, like, you're on your own kind of thing. Nobody said that because I think nobody expected me to actually get in. So like, go for it, like pursue your dreams. And for those listening who don't know, like Berklee College of Music is like the #1 contemporary music school in North America. So if you're going for pop or rock, not for classical, that's basically the place to be. And yeah, like 2,000 guitarists auditioned, 100 were accepted, and I got in, and then I didn't go.
Wow. Wow. That's crazy. So what was the other thing you were going to share with us?
Yeah. So on the other end of the spectrum, what nobody would believe about me, really, and my wife barely believes this about me actually, is that as a child, I had a debilitating speech and social anxiety. And you would never know that. You would never believe that, given that I've spent 15 years professionally on stages all over the world in front of hundreds or thousands of people, asking strangers to judge me in real time. But yeah, as a kid, I had a debilitating speech and social anxiety. I could not give a book report. There were times I vividly remember it was my turn to give the book report in, I don't know, 4th grade, 5th grade. I'd stand up. I'd barely make it to standing up, and everything would start spinning. I'd end up passing out, wake up in the nurse's office, sometimes get sent home. I couldn't do it. I had no friends because I didn't know how to make them, and everybody made fun of me. I was like, you're stereotypical, like Disney nerd. You know what I mean? Like right out of a Disney Channel original movie, I got books knocked out of my hand and shoved into lockers and all those things that define us later in life. And as you know, that's what we're, here to talk about. You get to choose how they define you, obviously.
Right.
But, yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty intense. And
yeah.
I'm already seeing the connections between that experience and why you became the person you were, in terms of not being a very nice person and not demonstrating to people in the way they needed it demonstrated that you cared about them. Like, it just is automatically coming. Like, I'm seeing images of you as a kid learning to hold back and learning not to trust people and learning that if you say something, somebody's going to tease you or take it wrong. And oh my gosh, it's painful just thinking about it. My heart is breaking for this little boy already, and I don't even know you.
I'm always cautious though when I tell my story to also, put it into context. And I think it's important these days to have stories like that in context, which is we've all had, I don't know anybody who hasn't had something difficult in their past. And on the scale of difficult things, mine is not so bad. And I'm going to just put that out there. We all have to deal with our own issues, but I mean, honestly, I grew up in an upper middle class socioeconomic household as a white male in America. My life was all right. Like I had issues, I dealt with them, and everybody has the right to, I think, be upset about the things that are affecting them, because you can only deal with the things that are affecting you, right? You can't
fix others.
Right. There are worse things affecting other people, but those worse things aren't happening to me. So I'm on both sides of that. And sometimes I hear people apologize in advance for complaining about something. I go, no, you have the right to complain about your own issues, but it's important to put it into context though, I think.
Right. Well, and it's all relative.
Right.
Because
exactly.
When we start talking about the changes that you made, the choices that you made, it doesn't matter where they came from.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what it was, your relative struggle. What matters is that you made that choice.
Yeah, no, I think and that's the core of everything, isn't it? Like whatever your background, because if you were born into a terrible, terrible situation, you really just got the worst cards in life, or if you were born into tremendous wealth, you still have a choice of what to do next. And yes, the choices available to you at the outset are very different in those two situations. But there are people who've been born into incredibly lucky situations that have simply done nothing valuable with it. They've made no positive contribution to the world. And then there's people on the other end of that spectrum, I think much more often than not, who have been in the worst situations and have made such a valuable contribution to their, community, their family, their friends, let alone the world at large. So,
and I think often it's about how we inspire others based on our stories, which are all relative in terms of struggle. So it brings it right back. If you want to inspire people, even if you don't intend to inspire people, like I am a public speaker, but I don't call myself a motivational or inspirational speaker, because that's really for the audience to decide if I inspire them.
Not to mention, for what it's worth, I always, when I transitioned out of my former career as a magician, which we haven't really got to yet, but when I transitioned out of that, which was actually the most amount of time I've done anything really, but when I became a speaker, initially, I really had to push back to that term motivational speaker for probably the same reasons you did, and you still do, which is I just get this idea in my head of just this like shuckster who's just like yelling at the top of their lungs and like overexcited. And then people leave the room and have no idea what to do with any of the excitement.
Right, exactly. There's no application.
Yeah, no application. So I was always very hesitant to go down the quote motivation. Like, I think if you tell your story well, and you are providing value, and you're giving practical stuff as well, people are inspired by somebody. You don't have to say inspirational things to be inspiring. You know what I mean?
Exactly. And that's kind of the point, is that if you want to make a positive impact on people, you have to own your story, even if the struggle is relative. And the story isn't the struggle itself. The story is the choices that you made to change. And when you talk about people who are born into material wealth and not necessarily emotional well-being and wealth, which we see playing out across the country in big ways right now in I'll call it leadership, but they're not leading, so it doesn't really count. But across the board, I'm not talking one political party or the other, but across the board, those people that are making decisions that are impacting hundreds of millions of people, what I've seen is that those same people that were raised in that wealth, but without the emotional health and the emotional support and well-being, that those are the people that make the worst decisions in terms of their relationships. And I think it all comes back to being relevant, and they make these decisions based on their desire for relevance, and it's not necessarily good relevance. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Relevance is, that's something I feel like we kind of never stop questing for, is to be relevant. Don't you love when you make a new friend and you realize all of the fun stories you tell at parties are new for them? They've never heard them. You get to be relevant again and tell them the 6 stories you love to tell. New person, got to pin them down. I think relevance is really interesting. I think one of the other really core components of what you were just talking about people in quote leadership roles who clearly are not leaders. And for what it's worth, in the middle, like the pandemic revealed, right? Crises reveal, and not just in politics, but there's a lot of employees, a lot of organizations all over the world that just discovered that their leaders are just bosses. Right? They're just bosses. Keep your webcam on, check in every 10 minutes. Oh, you're not a leader, you're a boss, and that's hurting a lot of organizations from the top down right now. But I think one of the things that really impacts the way that somebody's able to lead and make good or bad decisions like that, besides relevance, is simply perspective. And perspective comes from having a varied experience, right? Having a lot of different experiences and having collided with people and stories and cultures and backgrounds that are vastly different from your own, and being open to them. And so I think that actually, if you'll indulge for a half a second, I have a little, I tell this story to close out a lot of the virtual workshops that I run for organizations, just to leave them with something to think about. And this is from a 20th century Austrian semanticist whose name was Ludwig Wittgenstein. Now I'm going to back up because that was a lot to say in one sentence. So 20th century, so about 100 years ago, Austrian, from Austria, semanticist, studied meaning, philosopher of language. His name was Ludwig Wittgenstein. It's quite a sentence. So he had this one kind of story that he would tell. He had a million of them, but I have always zeroed in on this one. He said, imagine that there's a room, a small room with no windows and only one door. Okay, no windows, one door. The room is empty. Imagine a man in this room. Now, the door is unlocked and opens outwards. Okay? Empty room, nothing else. Man's inside, no windows. One door unlocked and opens outwards. The riddle is this. The puzzle is this. The man is trapped inside this room. How? How is a man trapped in a room that has a door that's unlocked and opens outwards? And the answer is he is trapped in this room if it never occurs to him to push instead of pull. And so, right. And so the reason that I use that story so often is because I feel like our minds are like this unlocked room, and we get trapped in there forever by our limited perspective, our limited experience of the world, if it never occurs to us to push.
Well, and if it never occurs to us that we want to leave the room.
Exactly.
I mean, you can be trapped and not even know you're trapped because you hadn't really thought about what would be outside of that door.
Exactly.
Or what you were capable of. Whoa. Yeah. That actually reminds me a little bit of conversation I had with a friend about constraints and how sometimes constraints can make us more creative. I generally like to work without constraints, but there are so many times where, that's just impossible. But I see so much more creativity sometimes when you're faced with that. And we are seeing that in a big way right now.
This is it. Case in point.
Exploded. Right.
I mean, right now, again, crises reveal, right? So there's like 80 to 90% of every industry right now, 6 weeks ago, kind of just curled up in a ball in the corner and are still there. And they'll be there a year from now too. But then the 10, 15, maybe 20%, probably not even, the 10% of every industry. And it's not always the people who were successful before 6 weeks ago. It's the people who saw this and went, in the midst of all the bad stuff, and we don't have to clarify that anymore. There's a tremendous amount of tragedy going on. But in the midst of that, there's an opportunity to rewrite the rules because the rules are gone. I mean, they just got wiped out in every industry, like legally and otherwise. And so like I talked to a lot of educators and I was on a live stream podcast thing for some educators a few weeks ago. And they asked me, when do you think things are going to get back to the way they were? And I said, I got to tell you, I've been asked that so many times by educators, teachers over the last few weeks. And these are the same teachers and educators who for the last 10 years have done nothing but complain about the way things are. Why are you so excited to go back to that?
That is such a great point.
This is it. This is your moment.
Oh my gosh, this is your opportunity. Change it.
Yeah, someone's going to rewrite the rules. It may as well be you. And there are people doing it right now. And what an opportunity.
Yeah. Within the constraints, they're finding the creative opportunity. So that leads right into why I wanted to ask you about your story, because so many people are in that room with just a door that they'd have to push instead of pull. But they don't make that conscious choice to try it, to try something different. They're stuck, they're complaining, they're stuck in this room and they're complaining about being stuck in this room. But they don't stop for a second and think, wait, who is making me stuck in this room? There's no other person in there. There's no tornado outside of the door. If you're stuck in that room, There's the only reason is you. So that seems to fit perfectly into your story. So can you tell me, really, I want to hear the more specific incident that right after you had that aha moment, when you applied your aha moment. So talk about the aha moment and then how you applied it and the specific incident that you went, oh, okay, this is going to work.
Yeah. So in terms of the story that you kind of originally connected over that I had posted about.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
And how
So
old were you when that, because I don't know enough details about it yet.
sure, of course. Okay. So basically, I'm going to take you back just a little bit further than that original comment to set the context, so I can kind of properly tell that story. So as we had said, I was kind of, bullied for most of my childhood. And then it was actually magic that kind of saved my life. I mean, I really shouldn't say kind of. Magic saved my life. So I was probably, it was right around the same time I picked up guitar, which is interesting. They both kind of happened simultaneously, which is I'd loved magic all my life. My dad and my grandfather were magic enthusiasts, magic lovers. They never did it professionally, but I was around magic and magic tricks and going to magic shows all my life. But the problem is, I don't know if you've ever done a magic trick or learned a card trick at one point. Almost everybody has. You cannot do magic for yourself. It is literally impossible to fool yourself with a magic trick. You are your own worst. You always know how the trick works. You're a heckler to yourself, right? So magic is, and I've been involved in a lot of art forms. Magic is unique in that it is an art form that literally requires an audience in order for it to be art. You can paint for yourself. Right? Yeah, exactly. You can paint for yourself, by yourself, and enjoy it and never show your painting to anybody. You can play guitar in a room by yourself and jam out and enjoy it. You cannot do a magic trick for yourself. It requires a participant to witness the trick and actually see it as magic and not as the secret, which is what you know. Right. So I had never done a magic trick for anybody else. And I was like 13, maybe, like 12, 13 years old. All my life, I've been doing magic tricks alone in my room. This is useless. It does nothing. But I had no ability to connect with anyone, to, this social and speech anxiety. The idea of showing somebody a magic trick was absurd. But there was this one day when I was sitting in the lunchroom and I'd had this card trick I'd been studying and I'd been learning. And I was so excited about it that for some reason that day, in that moment, the excitement over showing somebody this card trick and actually getting a reaction, getting a response from it, overpowered the social anxiety or whatever you want to call it. So I turned to the kids at that table. They weren't friends of mine. We were just kind of all rejects sitting at the same table, eating in silence, like all at the same table. And I turned to them and said, "Do you want to see a card trick?" And they said, "Sure." And I did. And I'm not saying that I did it well. I was shaking, right? I mean, I was shaking, probably sweating bullets, but I did it. And at the end of it, their jaws dropped. They freaked out. They called, and then they said, "Oh, hey, you guys, you got to come see this." And within a week, I was the magic kid in school, and I was popular. I mean, it was the jocks and to borrow some old school language, and the cool
stoners,
kids and the stoners, and everybody wanted, "Hey, Miller, you're that magic kid, right? Can you show us a trick before class?" And I got invited to parties, and girls talked to me, and it was hysterical thinking back on it, the dramatic difference in my life. And what happened was, while I was being a magician, I kind of got to play a role like an actor. I wasn't being me, I was being magician. And so I got to be all the things I wished I was. I got to just pretend to be. I got to be funny and quirky and kind of smart and popular and all this stuff. So here's the problem, though. In retrospect, right? Did not realize this at the time. What happens is, if you go from bullied, friendless, social anxiety, and you do a complete 180 to popular, everybody wants to be around you all the time. And I'm hearing, as a magician, the specific compliment you keep getting is how amazing you are. You're amazing. You're amazing. Well, you swing to ego really, really easily and really fast. Mm-hmm. This is very common with young entertainers, actors, comedians, almost anybody who starts to get success, who was
to believe their hype.
they start to believe their own hype. And why wouldn't you if you've been bullied and friendless your whole life, right? It's pretty common, unfortunately. So what happened was I got really good at being the magician guy. I got good at using those skills to meet new people. I would make friends easily. I'd get into relationships easily because I was cool and funny and magic and everything. But those relationships all crumbled just as quickly as they formed. The communication would break down, people would leave, and I would end up feeling alone. And it happened over and over and over and over again. And it's always easy to write it off on somebody else, to say,
right.
They can't handle how good I am. They can't handle how smart I am. They can't handle how successful I am. And
right,
eventually, they're just jealous. Exactly.
Yeah.
And eventually, I had to admit that it was my fault, right? That the people in my life didn't feel like I cared about them. And that wasn't true. I cared deeply. I was always a deeply emotional, that insecure, kid inside me was always there and is still there. But somewhere around 21, 22, kind of first year out of college, second year out of college, embarrassingly late as far as I'm concerned. But I finally realized it was my fault and that I'd been really doing a disservice to my relationships and harming my long-term prospects as a young business person as well.
Can you pinpoint a specific incident that made you realize that? Now that you look back, I mean, you wouldn't have known at the time.
Yeah, there were a few. The actual inciting incident was probably a breakup with a long-term relationship at the time, but that just made me realize the ones that were more impactful, I think. And it was really, I can remember a moment when one of my best friends in college, who I'd spent years, we just joined at the hip for years through college. There was a moment when I had felt like they didn't want to hang out with me for the last few months, and I just kept writing it off, or it's probably in my head or whatever. And I finally addressed them directly and said, "What's up?" And they were basically like, "Well, you're kind of an asshole." It was pretty much like straightforward, and I just don't want to be around you anymore. And we'd been joined at the hip for years. And so I graduated college, where I'd spent 4 years surrounded constantly by people I thought were going to be friends for life, like you always hear about. Mm-hmm. I am not friends with one single person I spent 4 years with in college. I've reconnected with them now. Life has changed. We're older. Right. I've gone back and apologized for that phase of my life. But it's never, it's not the same. Like we'll touch base a couple times a year and it's cordial. But I think that even though that wasn't the moment I decided to change my life, that was the moment I realized something was wrong for the first time. And then it took me another year and a half before I actually decided to do something about it. Yeah.
Right. It usually does take that time, the trigger, between the trigger and response.
Yeah.
So you graduated, and I can imagine that all those parties that you anticipated kind of dried up because you had kind of lost your social circle at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. Ouch. So I moved. Yeah. So I moved literally to a different state. I was in upstate New York, and I'm from Buffalo, New York originally, and I was going to school in upstate. And I moved to Connecticut and got a roommate and left everything behind, really. I mean, I have cousins here in Connecticut, so I crashed with them for a few months to see if I liked the area and if I could build a business and be able to afford an apartment. And I did. I started, building my magic business here in Connecticut at the time. And but yeah, I basically started over. So these people had never met me before. They didn't know me from anybody. And that's where things started to change. Yeah.
So what was the first relationship that you felt transformed, or not transformed because it would have been a new relationship, but what was the first relationship where you realized, okay, I have a choice here. I'm not going to do the same thing I did in college and high school?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's funny. So it was probably that's a really good question. So let me think on that.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm so glad this is not the same podcast interview I've done 300 times before. So thank you for that. Thank you for that. Because I go on a lot of podcasts, and usually they ask the same 5 questions, and I'm happy to answer them and tell my story. But this is great. I I had some professional relationships over the next year or two, kind of in that range, that I felt like I was developing a more meaningful connection with some clients, which was really helpful, where they would rebook me. I started getting rebooked, and it's amazing.
Okay.
Yeah, it's amazing how you realize you can get a standing ovation and not get rebooked. How could you not get rebooked? I got a standing ovation last year, and I remember thinking that this is crazy. Why wouldn't they bring me back? And then you look back and you go, oh, it's because they didn't like me. It didn't matter that I got a standing ovation. The client
Right.
didn't like being around me, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
And
And
so
being invited
yeah,
back is such a big deal. I mean, I've had the opportunity. I am also a musician. I sing in a few bands, and I've been known to do
yay.
all kinds of different events. And I remember the first time I was invited to sing with the same group again as a guest vocalist. And I remember
Yeah,
thinking, okay, these guys are really, really good, and they want me to sing with them.
yeah.
And just being invited back more than once, and then again, it you're right. It really has to do more with your relationship with them.
Oh, 100%. And this is something that I now, teach and preach to so many younger. I try to do my best to mentor younger folks coming up in entertainment and speaking and stuff like that. Kind of young business owners and things. And I find myself constantly now desperately trying to get them to not make the same mistake I did, and saying right from a very young age, whether
Right.
18, 19, 20, say, listen, you have to be good. Don't get me wrong, but that's about it. You have to be good enough. You have a lifetime to get better than good enough. If once you're good enough, the only thing that matters is that you make the people in your life feel heard, understood, and valued. If your clients feel heard, understood, and valued, they will bring you back over somebody who is technically a much better whatever you do, right? They will
Mm-hmm.
rather work with somebody that they enjoy being around, that they've connected with, that they enjoy being in their company, than someone who's technically better or gets better reactions, as long as you're good enough. You have to be good enough. There's a bar. After
Right.
that, work on your
And you have to
relationships, and
keep
then
getting better.
exactly,
It's
and
not
then
like
keep
you can
getting
just be good
better,
enough and be
right?
done.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I do think, and now, I have clients who, booked me, 10 times. Like I have a client,
Wow.
actually the first one who jumped on my pivot program, in the pandemic, right? So it was like,
Right.
okay, 1 week in, I've been a live event professional for 15 years. That's not coming back for maybe 2 years. What are we going to do? Right? That moment of, how am I going to
Oh, I
support my
know.
family? I got a baby on the way, my
Uh-huh.
first.
Oh,
Um,
congratulations.
Thank you. That is,
That's so
I feel
exciting.
like everybody who has said congratulations over the last 6 weeks has had that moment of congratulations and oh my God, what weird timing. Yes, very anxious, very anxious. But how am I going to support my family? And I got a baby on the way, and I make my entire living in live events. And what do you mean they're gone until 2022, right? Like there was that moment.
Seriously.
This
I
was a
know.
month ago. I mean, this wasn't some distant past we're talking about. And
Right, right.
so I can think right away, the first client, I picked up the phone and called this guy, Steve, who his organization has booked me 9 times in 4 years to speak
Wow.
for them for
Okay.
different groups. And I called him just days into this thing and said, Steve, in about a week or two, your entire organization is going to crumble as everybody goes to remote work for the first time ever. When that happens, I want you to call me because I got something I can help you with. He didn't even respond to that because he was in the middle of his own panic.
Of course.
A week later, he called me, said, got your message, never had a chance to respond. Brian, it's happening. What can you do? What can you help us with? And I said, well, I've never done this before, but here's what I think I would do for you. He booked it, paid. A week later, we did it. It was phenomenal. It was a virtual workshop that I ran, this communication, high interactive, online workshop about human connection in a virtual world. And now that is my entire business. For the last month, I've been doing these tons of times, but it's because I had a client who I have such a good relationship with. He just trusted me implicitly to do a program. I said, I've never done this before. I have
Right,
no idea what it's going to look like, and you're going to be a guinea pig. And he didn't say, well, then it should be free. He paid what he always pays me, and we did it.
right.
So that you
Awesome.
cannot do that if you don't have relationships.
Right. Absolutely. And it comes right back to that whole idea of You make the choice. And I think one of the misunderstandings that I get when I am helping people with this whole self-reflection thing and understanding how they're getting in their own way is that they say, well, I'm just me, and I'm not going to change. You can't, I mean, should I change for other people? I'm like, let's talk about that for a minute. And it's not really about changing who you are in that innate level. It's a matter of choice. It's looking at the relationships you have and either being satisfied or dissatisfied. And I think that's one of the things people really misunderstand is I'm not asking you to change who you are because nobody likes you.
Yeah.
I'm asking you to change how you're communicating with people because you are miserable, because you're bitter, because you don't have the relationships you want in your life. You have to take some culpability for that.
I love that you just brought that up. That is such for one thing, we're speaking very similar language. This is a very easy conversation for me. I'm on, I do a little bit of business coaching. I don't do the kind of lifestyle coaching. I think that you're I don't know if that's what you call it, but what communication coaching. I do it in a little different way. But my wife is a licensed marriage and family therapist, so like she is literally that is her job. Like
Right.
I preach empathy for a living. She is empathy for a living. You know what I mean?
Right. Right.
And so we're talking along the same lines here. And I love that you brought that up because I hear this all the time. It is amazing the blind spots that people have. And I had them, so it doesn't surprise me. But when
I still have them.
right? Of course, we all do. That's why coaches need coaches and communication specialists. I have a business coach. Like a month ago, I threw a couple $1,000 in one session real quick and said, I need help designing the future. But I'm the guy that other people go to for the same thing. We all need help because we all have our own blind spots. But I love what you said about people not wanting to change for others, but meanwhile they're complaining about how miserable they are because all their relationships are bad. And I feel this all the time with people who come to me for help with their podcast, because I've got a podcast. It's done reasonably well. You have a podcast, right? We all have a podcast now. It's just blogging 2.0. But some people start a podcast and they immediately get haters. People will say, this was no good, or I didn't, they'll comment on it and go, your audio quality is terrible, or your guests were really obnoxious, or I don't like that you curse all the time. I wish you didn't do that. And sometimes they say, they'll say, but this is my podcast. I get to do what I want. Who are they to tell me? And I go, well, you're right. You do get to do what you want. But apparently you doing what you want means no one's willing to listen. So you now have a choice. You have a choice to change the way you do things in order to reach the people that you're actually trying to reach, which doesn't mean being authentic. It actually means being more authentic, like changing the language and the style you use to actually make real connections with people you're trying to connect with. That is authentic, right? Ignoring the people that you're trying to connect with. Exactly. So I think it's just hysterical. Like, everybody keeps telling me that I curse too much, but it's my podcast and I'll do what I want. You're right. You can do that if you want. Then why are you complaining about it?
You have to understand the consequences of it. And that it brings us full circle to the beginning of your story, which is you had that awakening moment that you understood the consequences of your behavior. Yeah. And it was painful. It was awful, that last year of college, of understanding, okay, I earned this. I did this. And that sucks. That is the worst part of self-reflection, when you go, oh, that's me. I have to actually own that. And I keep remembering some of I'm also a Gallup certified strengths coach. And I was working with a client, and she said, I said, well, how are people describing you? And she basically said, a bully, aggressive, mean, whatever. And I said, oh, wow, how's that? She goes, I don't care what people think. And I said, okay, that's fair. You don't have to care what people think, but you have to be okay with the consequences of it. And then we had a whole discussion about whether she wanted it to ever be a manager, a leader. And I said, well, how effective do you think you're going to be if people describe you as being a bully? Do you think they're going to bring their best selves to work when they're working for somebody they think is a bully? How's that going to work for you? You're going to be a great leader, great manager? I would say probably not. You're not going to be very effective. And so that's your choice. You can choose to be an ineffective leader and manager because you don't want to change who you are in order to be effective, or you can change how you're behaving and help people be inspired to do their work. So that's your choice.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it really is. And I think once you adopt a mindset, this feels a little Gary V, and I'm always a little hit or miss on Gary V. I like him a lot, and then I don't like him a lot, and back and forth. I feel like I like him as a person, and sometimes I get frustrated with the way he delivers his message, but because I'm not an aggressive person. But one of the things that he says, a lot about that, which I think is very, very true, which is, if you assume everything is your fault, you have a lot more control over your own life. And I'm going to qualify that because I don't think everything is your fault. I actually think the role of luck and chance and synchronicity and fortune plays a huge, tremendous role in our lives. And I don't think enough successful people acknowledge the role of luck in their success. And I think that does a disservice to young people who have this idea that, well, if I'm not successful yet, I just haven't worked hard enough, and it's really damaging.
I haven't sacrificed enough.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not good enough. Right.
Exactly. And I do think more and more successful people really need to acknowledge the role of luck, whether that's randomness or chance encounters or privilege or any of those things. But having said that, if you just, like for me, my go-to reaction when something doesn't go well is, what did I do wrong? That's my go-to reaction. And not in a negative way, not in a self-defeating way, just in a, there must have been something I did because, this is I had totally forgotten about this. When I was a magician, one of my mentors in magic, he used to tell me, if you've had a bad show, before you start complaining that the audience sucked and the microphone wasn't good and it was raining out so people didn't want to come, and before you do that, ask yourself, can you think of a magician that you know who would have done a better show than you did tonight? And the answer is always yes. It's always yes. And if that's true, there's something you could have done to have a better show than you did that has nothing to do with the audience or the microphone.
So what lessons are you going to learn from it? What do you take from that?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think you need to find that line between, you don't want to just blame yourself for everything and crumble, but start by saying, there must have been something I could have done better than I did to affect the outcome.
Yeah, I see that a lot especially in work relationships. And I was just telling a client yesterday a story about a woman who gave me some feedback that was painful to hear. And of course, the first instinct was to be defensive. Well, she doesn't know, or she wasn't there, or she didn't listen, or whatever. And I remember it only took a few seconds for me to then think about how she had seen our interaction. And if that's what she got out of it, that's what mattered. It didn't matter what my intention was.
Yes. I just a buddy of mine that he and I run a little side project podcast together. We just talked about intention just a couple of days ago, so it's fresh in my mind. And I come down on that side basically every time, which is, does your intention matter? Yeah, of course it does. But does it really matter? Not really. What really matters is how people perceive your interaction. Because if people can twist your words and whatever, but by and large, people don't do it on purpose. They don't deliberately twist your words to get mad. Yes, there's trolls on the internet. Let's ignore them, right? There's always those people. But most of the time, if you've upset somebody, if you've been misunderstood by somebody else, it's because you were not conveying what you intended to convey. And so that comes back on, as far as I'm concerned, again, on me. I can think back and go, I know this is what I intended. And I thought I was saying it the right way, but somehow they got this other thing. what did I do to get them to that other thing? There must have been something.
Or
Yeah.
just as importantly, what happened to them before this that may have shifted their perspective that this is what they would have gotten out of that? What
Yes.
is their baggage? I mean, you can't know necessarily, but I've had that recently. My husband and I are going to celebrate 23 years of marriage next month.
Congratulations. That's amazing.
Thank you. And I still like him, which I think is pretty awesome. But even just a couple months ago, we had one of those where we had this weird tension and an argument. And of course, my first response was defensiveness, like you weren't listening, you don't understand. And then my next thought was, oh, okay, the way I presented it to him probably could have been done a little bit differently. And of course, I'm kicking myself because I'm a communication coach. I should know better. But we're human, and it's marriage, which is a totally different ballgame from the way that I coach my clients.
Of course.
But I remember having this moment where I realized, okay, he took it that way because in the past, that's how this happened. Mm-hmm. With me, with a previous girlfriend, with his dad, or whatever. So he was waiting for that message to come that way. And so that's how he got it.
Yes. And to that point, because mostly what I teach and train on, what I'm mostly known for, obviously, is the human connections, kind of like my tag and like the umbrella under everything. But basically what I teach and train is perspective taking. That is what magicians master intuitively without knowing what it's called. Magicians master the ability to take on a completely different point of view and see what they're doing from a different perspective. It's the only way to do it, because we know the secret. We know the opposite thing, that you're actually complete opposite thing. So the only way to create magic, to genuinely connect with an audience, is to be able to see the magic show that you're doing from their point of view. And that doesn't just mean visually, what angle are they at? It means, who are they? What is their background, culture, religion, ideology? What's the mood? If I'm on a college campus doing a magic show, what happened yesterday on campus, right? I remember a couple of years ago, I was on a campus, a client that had me multiple years in a row. And I was excited because usually this group, every year, they were just really energetic. And there was like this somber tone like in the room that night. And I wasn't used to it. I was like, what is happening? And the show hadn't started yet. So I went to my client and I said, did something happen? And she goes, oh yeah. And then, there was some really heavy, like a hate crime basically had taken place just yesterday on a predominantly, Black campus. And, it was like, oh, they're all really. And so I was like, okay, now I know what the audience is coming in with. If I jump up on stage and I just go into the, hey folks, here we go, how are we doing tonight thing that I always do, I'm going to lose them. I'm going to lose them in a second. But because I asked a meaningful and relevant question, right? Mm-hmm. Because which is the way you take on perspectives. You don't take perspectives by guessing. People do, right? That's the instinct. The instinct is to think, oh, if I were in their shoes, what would I think? No, that's guessing. It's purely random guessing because you're still taking your perspective into that thought process.
Exactly.
The only way to do it is to ask. So I asked, and because of that, I was able to walk up on stage and say, hey folks, some of us know each other, some of us don't. My name is Brian. I do a really fun, upbeat show. Before we get started, I just wanted you to know that I'm aware of what just happened the other day. At the end of this show, if anybody wants to stick around with me and have a conversation about it, I'm more than happy to. In the meantime, let's have some fun tonight. And by opening with that, the whole room, the tone shifted. And you can only do that if you're asking.
I love that story on so many levels, but it immediately triggered a memory of a podcast that I did a long time. It has to have been over a year ago with Joe Kwan, who's a charisma counselor, a connection counselor.
Yeah.
But he's writing a lot right now about charisma and building that muscle, the charisma muscle, which is very cool. And he has 2 books now and just really talented. But when I interviewed him, we were talking about how to connect with people that you don't necessarily know. But he gave me this example of, I want to say it was Aikido, but it was a different martial arts. I can't remember which one it was that he does. And he said, you have to match your energy with your audience's energy. And you don't have to stay there with them, but you have to match it when you're first trying to communicate and connect, because then you can slowly bring it to your level of energy. And he gave me the example of talking to his toddler who's in the middle of a total tantrum. A toddler in a total tantrum. Boy, that sounds, I remember my boys are big, but I remember those days. But he's like, if you go in and you're like, hey, it's all going to be okay, and that high energy, you've lost them. There's no way they're going to be responsive to that. But if you walk in and you sit down and you kind of match that, I know, I'm really upset too. That's really disappointing that that happened. Because at 2 years old, life is full of disappointments. Everything that doesn't go your way is huge. And so his idea of matching that energy just popped into my head when you told that story, because that's what you did. You sensed the energy, you asked where it was coming from, and then you began your presentation or your show with a match in that energy to let them know that you had compassion and empathy for what had happened.
Yeah.
And that's so awesome.
That's great. Yeah. No, the number one rule that I live by when I'm a speaker, even virtually, and that I teach and train to the folks that I'm helping learn how to do this kind of work, is just meet people where they're at. Meet people where they're at. If you keep that in your mind all the time, even when you're just, we're not right now in the middle of being out in the world, but at some point we'll be back standing in line waiting for coffee at Starbucks again. And when we are, and you're having that little, impromptu conversation with a stranger, same thing. Meet people where they're at, right? You gotta read the room, because it's like one of the, like you said, it's so little to do with content. Half the time, the stuff we say doesn't even matter. It's just the energy, it's the attitude, it's the tone, it's the way we say things that is by and large what people remember, and how you connect with them. So,
and how you inspire.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Action and joy and whatever you're experiencing is what you're going to inspire in the person around you.
Right. Which is why so many business owners right now in the middle of this pivot who are operating out of desperation are having so much trouble, because if you show up with an energy of desperation, that's what your clients and prospects pick up on, and you're not going to get anywhere. You're not going to get anywhere with, please, I'm desperate for you to book me. It's just not going to go there. And we all are. Everybody's desperate to get through this to the other side right now. But that energy that people are showing up with right now, and I'm seeing it in my industry, as I'm sure you're seeing it in yours.
Absolutely.
It's really damaging. It's damaging your long-term prospects too.
I just read a note on Facebook from one of my teacher friends saying, okay, parents, I know you're struggling in this whole idea of our school district is canceled for the year. They're going to finish the year virtually as far as that goes. And she said, okay, parents, I get it. You're totally stressed out. I'm sorry. I'm doing what I can to help. I need you to not say in front of your kids that this is totally stressing you out, that homeschooling is the worst thing that ever happened to you. You need to not be there in front of your children, because they are going to take ownership in that and think that they somehow made this happen. Kind of like when they think that they caused a divorce between parents. You can't tell them this isn't your fault, and they're going to just believe you.
Right.
So as long as you're putting out that energy, that's what they're picking up, and they're gonna feel it for a long, long time. So that's a really important piece that I hadn't really thought about. So thank you for bringing that up.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, this has been great, Brian. Total wild card. I had no idea what to expect, and I'm so glad that we connected this way. It's just been a really meaningful conversation.
Yeah, for me as well. Thank you so much. I honestly, I think it was Dominic you just had, which I think I think that's the episode I was responding to, who also totally randomly ended up connecting with, which is really wild. That somebody that you had a random, I don't even know what's going to happen connection, right? He reached out to you cold, I think you had said.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
With a
It
very
was
funny thing.
hilarious.
Yeah.
Yes. He said, sometimes I'm funny was his hashtag. I'd be a great guest on your podcast in the hashtag. Sometimes I'm funny.
That,
And I usually dismiss people writing comments on posts like that. If
sure.
he had written me a private message and
Yeah.
said, I have a great story and I would love to be on your podcast, that would have been different. But I generally dismiss the ones that come public on a comment on a post like that. But for some reason, so that is the way that you and I connected as well.
Yeah, which is wild because I don't even know Dominic. We have not formally met. We are only connected because he listened to the interview I did on my podcast with Heather Monahan, and he was following her. So like all within the last month, like he follows her, she came on my podcast, so he connected with me, and then he was on yours randomly, and that's how he showed up. You showed up in my feed, and it's wild that we can still do the ripple effect that people thought was going to disappear when the shelter at home, everybody's isolated, that we thought, well, that's it, right? All the human interaction, the human connection, the ripples, they're all gone. No, they're not. No, they're not. They're just in a different medium.
Yeah, not even a little bit. I would say it's. I think it's far more. As a matter of fact, I was on a LinkedIn Live with Heather Younger and a bunch of other podcast hosts talking about the fact that people are feeling more connected to people that they work with because they've been invited into their homes. I mean, you're doing these Zoom and other kinds of GoToWebinar calls, and people see your dog walk behind you, or your cat laying on your lap, or your kid walking in. You're being invited into their homes, and I think people are feeling like, oh, this person is actually a real person, and they have their own life, and it's putting things into context for people. And I just love that, and I just love that.
And let's remember to take that back when people somewhere in the next 6 months to 45 years go back to work. Who knows, right? I mean, in terms of COVID time is so strange, right? All I can think, I'll keep saying recently is like, what is it? Is it day o'clock? Like, I don't know what it is anymore. But at some point when people go back into actual offices and work and whatever that looks like, let's just remember that person that you pass a couple of times a day, that you only know a little bit, you only have their name once or twice. Remember that is an entire person with an entire life and an entire set of hopes and dreams and worries and concerns just as real and just as vivid as yours. We got to take that back with us.
Yes. And as my mother would say, from your mouth to God's ears. And just for our listeners, I will have links to Brian's website and anything that you want to ask him. Please feel free to connect with him on LinkedIn. I will have a link to his LinkedIn profile on the podcast, on the blog post associated with this podcast, on my website, elkinsconsulting.com. So I am really looking forward to keeping in touch and keeping this connection going, Brian. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Sarah. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will. If you're planning an event or company retreat and want to bring in a memorable, entertaining, and highly practical speaker as your keynote speaker or workshop facilitator, please visit us at elkinsconsulting.com to learn how we can help and provide a memorable keynote or breakout session. Thank you. I look forward to hearing from you.
Now listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going away?